Prince of Peace. I've been recording some sessions of a course called Invitation to the Gospels. It's kind of academic and 6 parts and requires probably a little bit too much of people, I guess, during these busy times or weird times. But I wanted just to make this shorter video that's kind of me redoing just one piece of it that I just thought you might enjoy or benefit from. I hope you will. And also just want to mention, I hope everybody's staying healthy and safe and hanging in there during these rough times. So I love this story. It's one of many interesting, beautiful stories in the Gospels. You know, just everybody knows about Jesus, the account of Jesus walking on the water. But it's also a great example of how Bible scholars kind of look at different stories in the Bible. So I'm going to do a little bit of just sort of academic background on this, and then we're going to really just kind of do a little meditation or a little bit of devotional about this complicated multi-leveled story. So here we go. The painting on the previous slide is a new painting. I just ran across the internet, put the author's name there. I'm going to show you several paintings, illustrations. Here's another one of Jesus walking on the water. And just want to ask you to take a look at this picture for a moment and ask yourself this question. If all we knew about Jesus walking on the water was what's in this picture, what story does this picture tell us? And so let's just take a moment to reflect on this. A little bit of a close-up there. So there's Jesus walking on the water. And by the way, I've just got to say this. Why do we have so many pictures, paintings of Jesus that present him as such a delicate person? You know, look at those hands. You know, I think Jesus was supposed to be a carpenter or a craftsman or built houses or something, furniture or whatever it is. Definitely was somebody who worked with his hands and worked hard. And I don't know why we seem to have so many pictures like this. Not to be irreverent, but also notice how many of our pictures of Jesus make him look like either Kenny Loggins or Dan Fogelberg. That's going to date me a little bit. Sorry. But again, what do we have here? First of all, as we'll talk about later, no indication of a storm, even though the story is very much about there being a storm when this happened. I guess those are waves in the background, not hills, but looks like some beautiful moonlight on a still sea. So I'll leave it to you, but this only tells me one thing, and that is Jesus was able to walk on water. And as we'll talk about, I think that's a very, that's not unimportant, but it's just the surface, so to speak, no pun intended, of what's a much, much deeper story. Here's another picture. And as we'll talk about in a moment, this is a part of the story that appears in the Gospel of Matthew, but not in the Gospel of Mark and not in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of Luke doesn't even have this story of Jesus walking on water. But this is what we get from Matthew. This is the whole part, as we'll talk about in a minute, of Peter. And so here we have a different story. Jesus is walking on the water. Peter has been sinking and Jesus is pulling him up. So that tells a very different story from the previous painting. I don't want to bog us down in a lot of dry academic stuff, but this is just all the background that you really need to kind of participate in what's going to be coming up as we go through this presentation. So just a little bit of background information. The synoptic gospels are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Synoptic means having the same view or a similar picture, meaning that while there are differences in how Mark and Matthew and Luke sort of portray Jesus, they all follow very similar outlines, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The Gospel of John is a very different matter. It has a different view of Jesus, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. But we're going to focus for this presentation on actually Mark and Matthew, because Luke again does not give us the story of Jesus walking on water. Luke does not. John does. By the way, the Gospel of John's account is very similar to Mark's. All right, so a little background. Almost all biblical scholars believe that Mark, even though it appears it's the second gospel we have in our Bible, was actually written first. That's almost universally believed. Mark was written first, and it most likely somewhere in the zone of 60 to 80 AD. We don't know when any of the New Testament, any of the books of the Bible were written precisely. We can only make guesses because none of the manuscripts were dated, none. So we don't have any manuscripts or anything in the text of the Gospels to tell us when they were written. So scholars have to try to estimate. So Mark was probably written first, and somewhere in that zone, 20-year zone, 60 to 80 AD. I typically just think of it in terms of 70 AD plus or minus 10 years. Matthew's and Luke's Gospels came later than Mark, probably something like 20 to 30 years later. John, by the way, came much later, perhaps around the year 100 or maybe as late as 110. Scholars believe, by and large, that Matthew and Luke worked independently from each other, and we have no reason to think they knew each other or knew of each other's work. They probably were geographically separated and members of different church communities. Scholars believe that Matthew and Luke both they had copies of the Gospel of Mark. So their Gospels could be thought of as revised and expanded versions of Mark. Scholars believe, there's all kinds of theories, but this is a very popular, prominent theory, is that Matthew and Luke, working independently, had a copy of Mark and likely had another written source, which scholars call Q. It's a hypothetical thing. But the scholars believe that there was a document floating around there that they have called Q. There's a long story, which was a collection of the sayings of Jesus. So in Matthew and Luke, you see much of Mark's material because they're revising, expanding it, and then some additional material from this collection of the sayings of Jesus called Q, and some other materials. So Bible scholars are interested in how Matthew and Luke take a story in Mark and then adapt it, expand it, change it, edit it differently for their purposes in their own Gospels. That's a big, big part of Bible scholarship. This is don't panic, I'm going to zoom in on this. This is a little handout which I'll make available to you. I'll put the link to it in a comment below this post or wherever this ends up. So this is the Mark account and the Matthew account of Jesus walking on the water. And then I've also got John's account here, and all we need to say about John is that it very closely follows Mark's account. So we're not going to really talk much at all about John. We're going to look at Mark and we're going to look at Matthew. And this is a little exercise in how the Mark story, which is earlier, gets expanded and revised by Matthew in this case. Again, just by reading, we're going to read the Mark account first. And Well, let me just go ahead and do that, then I'll follow up a little bit. I've got the picture of Jesus back up here walking on the water because that portrait is a good representation of how Mark presents Jesus walking on the water. So here we go. I'm looking at Mark chapter 6. Pardon me. Then he made his disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side toward Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And notice, by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but I've got these lined up so you can see the parallels in Matthew. And when he had taken leave of them, he went off to the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was far out on the sea, and he was alone on shore. Then he saw that they were tossed about while rowing, for the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, and by the way, that's typically understood as being first thing in the morning, very early morning, he came toward them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, and I'll say in a minute while I have this highlighted, why I have it highlighted. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. Fair enough. And they cried out. They had all seen him and were terrified. But at once he spoke with them. Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Now, all I want to say about the Matthew version is that it is virtually identical to the Mark version, up to this point, right? So we don't need to read it. And the reason I highlighted he meant to pass by them, that's the only thing in Mark that doesn't end up in Matthew's version to this point, and I don't know why. I don't know that it's particularly important. So the top here is where we ended up on the previous slide. But at once he spoke with them, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Continuing now with Mark. He got into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely astounded, meaning the apostles. They had not understood the instant of the loaves. On the contrary, their hearts were hardened. Now hang on to that. I've got that last section highlighted. We'll come back to it. Now, going back over to Matthew, and remember in Matthew's story up to take courage, it is I, do not be afraid, it's followed Mark very, very closely. But then Matthew adds a whole new part of the story that's not in Mark and is not in John. So I've got it highlighted there in blue or green or aquamarine, whatever that color is. Peter said to him in reply, so here comes Peter. Peter is not even mentioned in the Mark account. Peter said to him in reply, Lord, if it is you out there on the water, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. Jesus said, come. Peter got out of the boat and began himself. Peter walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Now you can see immediately that this is a major addition to Mark's story. So let's talk about this in just a tad more detail. Oh, wait, let me go back. So let's go back over to the Mark side here on the left, and this part that's in yellow, which is in Mark, but not in Matthew. They were completely astounded. They had not understood the instant of the loaves. On the contrary, their hearts were hardened. So that's in Mark. That's consistent with something you see a lot in the Gospel of Mark, which is not a very flattering portrait of the apostles. The apostles misunderstand. They're slow on the uptake. They don't really get it. It takes them a while to get it. So that's kind of consistent with a theme in Mark. They had not understood the instant of the loaves. In Matthew and in Mark and in John, and all three, this story of Jesus walking on water immediately follows the feeding of the 5,000, the incident of the loaves, as Mark says. So what Mark is saying here is that when Jesus walks on water, the apostles are astounded because they still didn't understand what a miracle worker Jesus was. On the contrary, their hearts were hardened. I don't really know what that means. I'm sure I know a zillion commentators probably have ideas about it, but since I don't remember or I don't know, I'm not going to talk about it. Okay. So now we have a story that's consistent with the illustration that I showed you earlier. So what do we have in Matthew that we don't have in Mark? Peter walks on the water, and then he sinks when he sees how bad the storm is, and he says, "Save me." Peter sinks because of his lack of faith. Jesus does save him, right? Pulls him up. So that is a major addition to the story and enriches this story completely, tremendously, right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing is this ends, unlike Mark. Mark says they're just shocked because they don't get it. Matthew ends with the apostles making what we call a profession of faith. Sometimes it's called a confession. That's kind of confusing language. Look at the last verse. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Peter, obviously central to this Matthew's version, and we associate Peter with Peter's confession. Remember Jesus says to him, and this is a climactic moment in the Gospels. Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" And the apostles say, "Oh, some people say you're Elijah, some people say this." And Jesus says to Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That's a turning point, right? So it's interesting to me that Peter, who we associate with that confession elsewhere, that profession, confession, elsewhere in the Gospels, here is in the boat and he's with the apostles. They're saying, "This is the Son of God." So it's very clear that this is an example of a story in Mark that's kind of stripped down, is really only about Jesus being able to walk on water. And then Matthew takes that story and adds, because he probably had a different oral tradition of this story being told, and includes this essential part, really, about Peter. Just did, by the way, is what Bible scholars call redaction criticism. Criticism means analysis in this case. And redaction means change, like a redacted document. And so redaction scholarship, Bible scholarship, means typically means you take a story that is in Mark, which is believed to be older than in Matthew and Luke, and you look at how either Matthew or Luke revises, changes, adds to that story in Mark. That's redaction, that's change. And then from that, you try to figure out why they did that. What were they trying to say something different from Mark? That's called redaction criticism. There's also this thing that scholars do called word studies, which is really just a way of trying to understand what, how different words in Greek are being used and what they mean. And so there's a famous example of this in this. So we'll do a very quick just reference to that. Look back at at verse 27. We'll use the Matthew version, very top of this on the right-hand column. At once Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, it is I. It is I. The Greek is ego eimi. And it's very famous. It's used a lot in the Gospels. Jesus says, "It is I." But here's this interesting thing about Greek and how everything turns on translation. In ancient Greek, ego eimi could be translated, "It is I," "It's me," right? "It is I." But it also can be translated, "I am." I am, I exist, right? So that goes back to kind of like Old Testament Moses burning bush kind of thing. So this phrase, I am, is used a lot in the Gospels, and it often has a kind of a double meaning. The surface meaning is, it's me, it's I. The deeper meaning is this much more mysterious and spiritual statement. I am. I, Jesus, am. So that's just, I just wanted to mention that before we go any further. Okay, so we're done with kind of the dry academic analysis. Let's talk about what this story might mean to us now as a message. So one thing this story tells us, Mark tells us, it's really all Mark tells us. Matthew tells us more. Jesus was a miracle worker. We have lots of stories about that, and this is a very vivid, familiar story. Jesus was not an ordinary guy. He was a 100% human, but he was also 100% divine. He could walk on water. That's not insignificant. But Matthew gives us, to be blunt, a much richer story by adding this element of Peter. And so let's think about it. This all happens in a storm. And this is not like some kind of goofy, literary silliness. How do we think of the word storm and stormy? We use the word storm metaphorically all the time. These are stormy times. I'm going through a stormy period. It's a stormy marriage. It's a stormy relationship. And obviously we're not talking about the weather. So there's every reason to think that in this story, it's very clear in the Bible, in these gospel accounts, that the storm is not just a storm. It represents something. So let's think about, let's just use this casual language. And this comes to us really in Matthew. When life gets stormy, right? Jesus is on top of it. The wind and the water represents the storminess of life. Jesus is on top of it, to use sort of a modern sort of slang. Enter Peter, who gets out of the boat, walks on the water himself because of his faith. But then when he sees how strong the wind is, how bad the storm is, so metaphorically, when he sees how bad things are, he begins to lose his faith. And what does he do? He sinks. That's another metaphor. We use the term sink to mean a whole lot more than just going under the water. I'm sinking into a depression. The economy is sinking. All these things, right? So Peter, because of his lack of faith, the faith is keeping himself above the storm until he sees how bad things are, and then he sinks. And Jesus says, "Oh, ye of little faith," and pulls him out. So just as Peter was able to walk on water because of his faith, we can get through difficult times by way of our faith. if we lose our faith, we may sink. Jesus is there to pull us up, right? So that's how this is also, let me say this and I'll be done. This is an example too, one of my favorite examples of why we should avoid being too preoccupied with the literal story. If we just look at the literal story, all we really have, particularly in Mark, is that Jesus can walk on water. Now that's not a small thing, but we already know from other things in the Bible that Jesus can work miracles. So we could sit around and debate about whether or not Jesus really walked on water, or is it this a made-up story or whatever. But once we just let go of the literal piece of this, which is Jesus being on top of the water, we can get into so much of a deeper understanding of what the message is, right? So most Catholics, we're not really taught to be literalists in our way we interpret the Bible. We take the literal sense of the gospel stories seriously. But if we get too preoccupied with literalism, then we miss the beautiful message and critical messages under that. So I think the story of Jesus walking on water, particularly in Matthew's version where we have Peter enter, is just an incredible example of how we can take a Bible story and really apply it to our lives under the best of circumstances, which can get difficult and stormy, and particularly in these times when I'm presenting this in 2020, when we're in this terrible national crisis, that this is a stormy, stormy time. So it's a good time to reflect on the story of Jesus walking on water, Peter walking on the water, sinking, getting pulled back up by his faith. Beautiful paintings about this. I think I said on an earlier slide, who was the artist here? I can't remember now. Just love the color on this and the light around Jesus, beautiful. Another one, I was thinking about what the gospel says about they thought he was a ghost. If you look at this painting and say, yeah, that's fair enough. It looks like a ghost there, right? Okay, well, I'm done. I hope that you enjoyed this or benefited from it or both. I just think for me, it's a great reflection, this gospel story, for these difficult, stormy times. We're continuing to pray for you at Prince of Peace. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks so much for viewing this, and bye for now.